Well, I've got a friend. We'll call him Jimbo. It's a true story, right? And so Jimbo, he's a spontaneous guy, ready to move at any time. So if I was to reach out to Jim and say, "Hey, we should plan a beach trip," he would say, "Great. What are you thinking? Thursday?" I'm like, "Well, no. Like it's winter. We should think like summertime." But he's just ready to roll whenever. He doesn't need a lot of planning for him to roll up his sleeves and to take action. All right. The complete opposite of Jimbo would be my wife, Lucy. Lucy is an ultra planner. And so she might not show her cards, but if we're taking a trip, she's got a journal with notes about every detail and what could go wrong and what do we do in case it goes wrong. So if we go to Disneyland or Disney World, and she's got the day planned out, we're going to show up at this time. This is when the rope drops. We're going to go to this attraction first, to that attraction. Then we'll spend our first Genie Pass. Then we're going to go to this attraction, re-up our Genie Pass here. Like she's got it all planned out. And you might think like, okay, what happens if it goes wrong? Well, if we get to an attraction and it's closed, she has option B, C, and D just in case that we know. So on the front end, super stressful, but when it comes like to the actual day of, it's amazing because of all the planning that she's done on the front end. And I think most of us fall into one of those two categories. Some of you are doers. You're just ready to roll, while others of you are planners. You want to know all the details and get everything laid out. And what we're going to see today in Nehemiah chapter 2 is that we need both. We need to be prayerfully planning and we need to be ready to take action. So if you got a Bible, Nehemiah chapter 2. Starting in verse 1, it says, "In the month of Nisan," that's the Babylonian calendar, not our calendar, "in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, 'Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick?' 'This is nothing but sadness of the heart.' Then I was very much afraid." All right, let me catch you up real quick. Last week we met Nehemiah. He's living in the capital of Persia. His brother comes to visit him from Jerusalem and tells him that things in Jerusalem are not good. I mean, the city gates have been burned down, the walls are broken down, they're vulnerable, it's a dangerous place. And this breaks Nehemiah's heart. And so he goes to the Lord in prayer. He spends time praising God for who he is. He spends time confessing his sins before God. He finds himself holding on to God's word and God's promises, and then he asks God to grant him success to the degree that he is working towards God's will. And so we saw the importance of prayer last week. So Nehemiah was a man of prayer. Now that was in the month of Chislev, Babylonian calendar, not ours. Now we're in the month of Nisan. That's a 4-month period. All right, so we've gone 4 months where Nehemiah has been praying and fasting and seeking God's heart to know God's will, right? And so now we get to this point where we find out he was a cupbearer to the king, and now it's the month of Nisan, which would have more or less been like the Persian Mardi Gras, right? A big party. And so as the cupbearer to the king during the Persian Mardi Gras, he would have been like the personal bartender to King Artaxerxes, right? And he tells us, he's like, "Look, I've never been sad in the presence of the king. Like I've never shown sadness to him." You might be wondering, like, is that an important detail? Absolutely, right? When I was in seminary, after college, I worked at a car dealership as a car salesman, right? It's like if you were like, what did he do before he was a pastor? I was selling cars, slinging deals, right? But I had a sales manager named Joe. Joe was the happiest guy you'd ever meet. I mean, he'd walk into the dealership just with a smile on his face. If he walked into a room, spirits automatically lifted. He was a great guy. Well, there was a season where a particular salesman kept coming into the dealership just sad, just dragging. And his presence began to bring other people down. Like if you were around him, you'd be like, "This job is the worst job in the world. I don't want to be here either," right? And Joe took this guy to the side one day to give him a little pep talk, right? And we're all leaning in like, what's he going to say? And as we listened to Joe talk, he began to tell him about all the stuff he was dealing with, stuff with his parents' health, stuff with his marriage, stuff with his kids, stuff with his home. And all of a sudden he goes, "You know what I do though? I check that at the door, because when I come to work, my job is not to bring people down, but to build them up." And he looked at the salesman. He said, "Look, either check your stuff at the door or get a new job. And maybe you agree or disagree with his tactic of management and leadership, but here's the idea. He's like, man, your job when you come in here is not to drag people down, is to build people up. And so as the cupbearer, Nehemiah's job was not to bring the king down, but to lift the king up. And so if anybody was to come into the king's presence and to cause him to be sad, if anyone was to come into the king's presence and ruin the day or to be a party pooper, that was considered to be extremely offensive, right? It was considered to be disrespectful, and it was actually an offense that was punishable by death. And so he's like, hey, for every year that I've worked for the king, Nehemiah is saying, to this point, I've always checked my stuff at the door. Like, no matter what I've been dealing with, I've never stepped into the king's presence with a sad face. I've always checked it at the door because my job is not to bring him down, but to lift him up. But this particular day, it's like, man, he's been trying to hide it, but he gets to the point that he just can't hide it anymore. I don't know if you've ever been there, where life is hard, things are falling apart, and you're doing your best to put on your best face, but eventually you get to the point that you just can't hide it anymore. That's where Nehemiah is. So the king says, hey, what's going on? And rightfully so, Nehemiah was very much afraid, which is a biblical way of saying he's freaking out, right? He's like, oh, this could cost me my life now that I'm exposed, now that he sees that I'm sad. But because Nehemiah has been praying towards this moment, he sees this as an opportunity or a door open for him to step through. All right, verse 3. I said to the king, let the king live forever. That's a phrase or a term of respect. So he's showing great respect for the king. May the king live forever. But then he goes on, he says, why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves. He does not say Jerusalem. That's an important note. He says the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. Right? And so he's saying, like, look, when I think about the place of my ancestry, like the ancestral city, the place where my fathers grew up, my grandfathers grew up, the heroes of my faith grew up, and where their graves are, he's like, when I think about that place, my heart breaks. And what he's doing here is he's trying to get Artaxerxes to think about his ancestral city, to think about what it would be like for his ancestral city to lie in ruin. So he's trying to make an emotional connection here with the king, right? And then the king said to me, verse 4, what are you requesting? Like, what are you, when the king says, what are you requesting? He's saying, I'm listening, right? I'm not looking to kill you right now. I'm genuinely interested in what's going on. And Nehemiah says, so I prayed to the God of heaven. And I love this. So I prayed to the God of heaven. And then he just goes into what he's going to say next. All right. This is what we would call a QP, or a quick prayer, a breath prayer. I think so often we can fall into this trap of thinking that whenever you pray, it has to be long and drawn out. I remember one time I was at a gathering with a bunch of friends and family. And there's one particular person there, one of my best friends, Charlie, and he is a man of God, like just the fatherly, wisdom, scholarly. And so when he prays, you feel like you're at the throne room. You're like, man, this guy he's a prayer warrior. And so it's like, Charlie, would you bless the meal? And he goes, yeah, sure thing. All right, you guys bow your heads. God, thanks for this food. Amen. And when everyone's eyes open, we kind of thought we were going to go to the throne room, and we're like, what? This feels a little short. And he looks around the room, can kind of read that people are confused, and he goes, dinner is not a time to catch up on prayer, right? Like God is okay with breath prayers, like a prayer that you can say in a single breath. That every prayer doesn't have to be long and drawn out. And so he just says, God, I need your help. He's like, so I prayed to the God of heaven, God, give me help, because he knows what he's about to ask. In verse 5, he says, and I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. And so when he says, if it pleases the king, this is showing submissiveness. He's saying, I can only do what you will allow me to do. I understand I'm underneath you, right? If it pleases the king, he goes, if I found favor, like if you trust me, if you trust my character, if I've done a good job, if I've earned any type of credit with you, would you let me go back to the place of my ancestors to rebuild the city? All right, and the king said to me, verse 6, the queen sitting beside him, how long will you be gone and when will you return? He's like, how long is this type of thing going to take? Now, Jerusalem was 900 miles away from Persia. That is a 4-month journey to get there. So 4 months to get there, 4 months to get back. So now we're at 8 months plus the time of the work. We're talking a minimum of a year, but most likely this was like a 5-year request. Right? He's like, could I have 5 years off? All right. And so when the king finds out, though, like how long it's going to take, it says, so it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, let letters be given to me to the governors of the province beyond the river. All right, beyond the river, that's Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, Israel, a huge plot of land. He's like, would you give me letters to the people beyond the river that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah, and a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple and for the wall of the city and for the house that I shall occupy, right? This is a big request. He's already asked for a year off. He's like, or maybe 5 years. Could I have 5 years off? Then he goes, and I'm also going to need some rites of passages. I'm going to need a letter of recommendation because I'm going to take another job while I'm gone. Do you mind funding the whole thing? I'm also going to build myself a house. Like, this is a big request, okay? It's a huge request. And what's crazy, if you go back 13 years to the book of Ezra, chapter 4, Ezra and Nehemiah go hand in hand. In the book of Ezra, chapter 4, the kings and governors of the province beyond the river, they actually asked King Artaxerxes to shut Jerusalem down. So 13 years prior, some people said, hey, would you keep this city in ruins? Like, don't let people rebuild it. And the king's like, may it be written. And so now here, Nehemiah is saying, hey, I know what you said 13 years ago, but would you reverse course? Like, would you change your mind on that? Look, you make this request like for one of two reasons. One, you've sampled way too much of the king's wine. Or two, you've heard the voice of God, right? And so I'm going with Nehemiah has heard God as he has spent time seeking his heart. So he makes these crazy requests. And then it says at the back end of verse 8, and the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. Right? He's basically saying like the favor of the Lord was upon me. The only reason why God granted this crazy request is because this was in line with God's heart. And so maybe you're sitting here thinking, Jeff, I want to experience God's favor like that. Like, I would love to walk in such a way that I'm like, I'm going to make the craziest request ever, and my boss is going to be like, you got it. Like, how do I do that? Well, if you want to live in the favor of the Lord, follow Nehemiah's example. Right? Nehemiah's example for us is spending time in God's presence, listening for his voice, praying and fasting, continually confessing your sins, and seeking God's will above your own. If you will do those things, you will find yourself living in the favor of the Lord or with God's good hand upon you. Right? Verse 9, then I came to the governors of the province beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent me with officers of the army and horsemen. I love this. Like, did he ask for officers or horsemen? No. So the king gives him all these things and goes, you're probably going to need some more than you even asked for, right? So the king gives him what he needs. Verse 10, but when Sanballat, the Haranite, and Tobiah, the Ammonite servant, heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel, right? This is giving us some of the antagonist to the story. This is giving us some opponents to Nehemiah's work, specifically a guy named Sanballat and a guy named Tobiah. But what's crazy is in Jeremiah 29:7, when God looks at the people of Israel, he says, pray to the Lord, right? He's like, seek the welfare of the city where I've sent you into exile and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare, you will find your welfare, right? So we know that God wants his people to show up to cities and to be a blessing for them. Here, they're not going to some foreign land. They're returning home to be a blessing. And people are going like, I don't want the welfare of the Lord happening here. Which means, hear me on this, whenever you do the work of God, expect to face resistance, right? Whenever you are working to bring welfare to the city on God's behalf, whenever you are seeking to bring God's kingdom to earth, you are going to face resistance, right? When I think about how it displeased them, it makes me think about, I was listening to a podcast where they were talking about the homelessness crisis in California. And some of the major cities in California have people that are put in positions to help solve the problem. And what they've said is that these people in their positions where they're making great money, they don't really have incentive to fix anything. Because if they fix it, they lose their jobs. So instead, they just try to keep people comfortable and to keep the situation manageable so they can continue to collect their paycheck. They're like, I don't really want to see these parts of town get better because if they get better, I'm out of a job. So here's Sanballat and Tobiah basically saying like, man, if the city gets better, we might lose our positions of authority or our positions of influence as leaders in the area. So it's like, man, we don't want to see this place get better. And continuing on, verse 11, so I went to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. Then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me, and I told no one, and just take note of this phrase. We're going to come back to this for the application. I told no one what my God had put into my heart to do. Right? Just take note of that phrase, what God had put in my heart to do. All right, we'll come back to that. In verses 13 through 16, Nehemiah takes like a secret mission at night. He goes at night and he starts inspecting things. He goes to this gate and that gate and this gate and that gate. And he basically finds out that everything his brother told him back in chapter 1 is true. The city is lying in ruins, right? So he's like, man, this is bad. Let me get to verse 17. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. He's now talking to the people that have returned to Jerusalem. You see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem that we may no longer suffer derision. And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also of the words that the king had spoken to me. And they said, let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for the good work. All right. And so here we see that he spent time praying. He spent time planning for 4 months. And now he gets to the point where he is rallying people to take action. He's calling his Jimbos, right? He's like, you guys, we got to do something about this, right? And he tells them the testimony. He goes, let me tell you, if you're wondering, like, this seems pretty crazy, he goes, let me tell you something crazier, right? I've been seeking God's heart. Here's what God told me to do, right? So now he tells him the work that God has put in his heart. He's like, and you might be thinking, like, how did you get out of the king's presence? He's like, I went to the king and I asked him for this, that, and this. And you might think that would be off with my head, but the king goes, yep, go ahead and do that. And in fact, I'm going to give you more things that you didn't even ask for to ensure your success. And as the people hear the story, they're going, God's at work. And as they hear God's testimony of how he is at work, it inspires confidence in the people. So when he says, let's rise up and build, the people's response, knowing that this is a work of God, is let's go. Let's do this thing. Like, we're ready to take arms. We're ready to build. We're ready to do whatever it takes to reestablish God's city here on earth. Like, man, it's this beautiful picture, right? And so when I think about that, can we take a commercial break? You're like, Jeff, it's like 10 o'clock already. Do we have time for a commercial break? Yes. All right, commercial break. Let me tell you something really cool. Right? It's no secret that Redeemer is looking for a long-term home. We're looking for the place that God has sent us. So we got to this point of saying, hey, we need to do a campaign. God, if you want us to have a home, would you bless it? Right? If you don't want us, if you want us to keep renting, if you want us to keep having the risk of this place, God, if you don't, then kill it. Like, we're asking that you just kill this thing, right? So experts said that we could raise 1.2 million, right? The goal, right? The need is actually 7 million. So we need 7 million. 1.2 million doesn't really move the needle that much, but we said we got to start somewhere. Then God blessed it, and we brought in over 3.6 million in pledges. It's like a triple portion. And we're saying, okay, God, it seems like you're saying you want us to have a home. You're providing means for us to move forward, right? So then we're starting to say, okay, God, where do you want us? And so we have our heart as a church. We're saying, this is where we would love to be. God, would you open doors? And then what happened is door after door after door, when it was about our will, what we wanted, were slammed shut in our face. It's like, I don't like, why does this keep happening? It's like door after door, bust your nose. You realize, like, there's this other thing that God has said, I've opened this door. Like, I've literally opened this door and like been like, and you're sitting here being like, let's go over here. It's like stop knocking on doors. I'm slamming shut. Go to the door I'm opening, right? And so we've sought God's heart. We've looked at the way that he's opened doors, closed doors, and we've found that, like, man, like, it seems like God is saying, this is where we want you to be. So cat out of the bag, Redeemer has purchased land, right? And if you're like, yeah, woo, all right, commercial break, we can clap. So all that to say, if you're like, Jeff, I want more details, pull out your handy dandy invitation from the bulletin, RSVP to that thing, get ready to make some fried chicken, French fries, corn, and coleslaw, and we're going to have all the details rolled out for you guys then. But you got to come to that. So commercial break over, right? So all of a sudden, because I'm telling you, if you guys hear this story, commercial break back, if you guys hear the story of how God's working, you're going to go, how do we argue with this? And I want to share that story with you, all right? So when you hear the story of how God's working, it's going to be really hard to argue with it. I want you to hear the story then. All right, back to the text, all right? Finishing up in verses 19 through 20, it says, "But when Sanballat the Haranite and Tobiah the Ammonite, servant of Geshem the Arab, heard of it, they jeered at us and despised us and said, 'What is this thing that you are doing?'" That's like an accusation, right? What is this thing that you are doing? "Are you rebuilding against the king?" So Nehemiah's enemies are saying, "Are you trying to resist King Artaxerxes? I know what he said 13 years ago when he said to shut this thing down. Are you trying to do something against that?" Then, verse 20, "Then I replied to them, 'The God of heaven will make us prosper, and his servants will arise and build, but you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem.'" I love Nehemiah's response. He could have taken the letters. Like they're like, "Are you trying to resist the king?" He could have said, "Read it for yourself." But instead he goes, "Yeah, I'm not even going to do that. God's going to do what he's going to do. Try to stop him," right? Said in a Billy Bob Thornton voice as he's addressing the cartel, right? Landman. All right, all that to say, like here he's like, God's going to do what he's going to do. Try to stop him. All right, so as we look at this text, what's the big idea? What I want you to see today is there's so much importance for us when we want to know what's the work God has called us to do, to be people who both pray, plan, and people who do, right? Now, the truth is some people need to spend more time praying. You just roll with the punches. You've made so many big life decisions about the job you'll take, the neighborhood you'll move to, the things that you will purchase with your excess income. Like so many of you guys make decision after decision after decision with little to no prayer. And the call for you is like, hey, you need to start praying more. And others of you, you'll pray till the cows come home, right? Like you'll pray and keep praying, and God's saying, I need you to move, right? Because a good plan at the right time is always better than a perfect plan at the wrong time. So some of you guys need to learn to do. But here's the big thing I want us to get today. The big takeaway is I want you to leave here today with an exercise that will help you discover what God is calling you to do, okay? So here's my question. What is God calling you to do for his kingdom? What's God calling you to do, right? If you think about verse 12, and Nehemiah with confidence says, this is the work that God has put in my heart to do. What is that work for you? What is God putting in your heart? Right? And so to understand or to find this, it's like taking 3 circles and then making a Venn diagram out of them, right? So the first circle we talked about last week, where I said, what breaks your heart for God's purposes? Like if you were to see the world as God sees it, where would you see joy and beauty, but where would you see brokenness and hurt? And so the first circle is like, take time and say, God, I want to see your purposes in the world. Right? So that's circle number 1, taking time and saying, God, help me to see the world as you see it. What brings you joy? What brings you heartbreak? What is it that you want with the world? That's circle 1. Circle 2 is this would be called like your gifts. These are things that you're naturally good at. You're like, man, I'm good at math. I'm good at music. I'm good at conversations. I'm good at Excel sheets. Like these are things that God just has naturally gifted you for. All right, so that's circle number 2. Just think about like, what are the things that you're good at? What are your natural strengths? And then 3, the third circle, I know I'm flying here, so I'm hopefully you're taking notes. All right, the third circle is your passions. Like your passions. What are the things you're passionate about? The things that your heart beats for, that you're like, man, I want to do something about this, okay? And so the truth is like the things you're good at and the things you're passionate about might not always align. Like you might be really, really good at math and Excel sheets, but you are not passionate about accounting, right? Like I don't care about, assets and stockholders' equities and liabilities. Like I don't want to do none of that stuff. Like that's not my passion. So just because you're good at it doesn't mean you're passionate about it. Other things you might be passionate for, but you're not good at. Like you might be passionate about leading worship, but you can't hold a note or carry a tune, and like you don't need to be up here. It's like just because you're passionate, like Jerica, can I join the worship team? It's like, no, you can't. Don't put me in that awkward position of telling you no because you can't sing. Like I've heard you, right? Like someone just broke right now. They're like, is that why she told me no? But all of a sudden, here's what I want you to hear is She's like, no. Um, the work that God has called you to do will be found at the intersection of those three circles. The work that God has called you to do will be found at the intersection of those three circles. And here's what happens. Your name is not on every need that the world has, but it is on a need that the world has. And so as you think about God's purposes and the way that God sees the world, you're going to have an ocean full of opportunities. Like, do I need to do this? Do I need to do that? You're going to be overwhelmed. And because you're overwhelmed, you'll most likely do nothing. But when you start looking at God's purposes, your gifts, and your passions, and look to the intersection of those three things, an ocean shrinks down to a pond that now gives you something manageable. Now your job, right? So I'm trying to give you an exercise to do on your own, is to take that intersection and then prayerfully bring it to God for as long as it takes, asking him, God, what do you want me to do with this? God, what do you want me to do with the intersection of your heart, my gifts, and my passions to bring your kingdom into this world? And then once you have that thing and you've prayerfully considered it, begin to do, begin to take action. And what will happen as we, as God's people at Redeemer, begin to live into our callings, we will become a blessing to the city and the region we're in and even beyond. All right? So if we want to bless our city, if we want to bless our region, if we want to seek the welfare of where God has placed us, we need to do the work to know the work. We need to do the exercise and to do the work to know what God has placed in our hearts to do. God, thank you for your word. I know, Father, I know we flew today. I feel like I preached like an auctioneer. Um, but God, I trust that you have a word for your people today, that you have a work that you want to put in our hearts to do. God, for your greater purposes, that you want to strengthen us as a church and to build us up to be like a city on a hill so that we can then become a blessing to the city you have placed us in and beyond. And so, Father, would you help us to do the work of finding the intersection of your heart, our gifts, and our passions? And God, would you give us the thing that our name is on so that we can take part in what you're doing to make earth look more like heaven to come? It's in your holy name we pray. Amen.